basically, people have been saying for a long time that the Amazon is the lungs of the world. Basically, for a long time, people have been saying that the Amazon is the lungs of the earth. And the rainforests, in a general sense, have been a source of oxygen and have been a sink for carbon. But in the last decade or two, as deforestation rates have escalated, actually, because of the carbon emissions from deforestation, the Amazon is now a net emitter of carbon. It's not a net sink, but a net emitter of carbon. Now, although people have been saying the Amazon are the lungs of the earth, scientists are now actually saying it's more like the heart of the planet. And this is something indigenous peoples have always said, that the Amazon is the heart of the earth. And really, the Amazon, the amount of water that basically evaporates and transpires from the trees in the Amazon and from the soil, generate more heat over the Amazon than anywhere else on the planet, creating a chimney effect that literally drives weather in a, around the earth. So it is really the pump, or the heart. Just like our heart pumps blood through our bodies, the Amazon pumps water, vapor, and heat around the planet, driving weather systems and rainfall all over the earth.
That's great.
And so just to say a little bit more about that, deforestation, scientists are now telling us through climate modeling that deforestation in the Amazon is actually contributing to a reduction in rainfall as far away as California and places like the Midwest, and even places like New Mexico and northern Mexico, specifically in the spring and summer when the rains are needed for agricultural productivity. And I'll also say a little bit about the amount of rain that the amount of vapor and moisture and heat that's generated over the Amazon actually contributes to rainfall all over the continent of South America. In fact, when you look at Sao Paulo in southern Brazil and Argentina, scientists are actually saying something like 80 to 90% of rainfall in southern Brazil and Argentina come from the Amazon. So what's happening currently? Because of climate change, the Amazon is actually drying. And the drying of the forest, combined with deforestation from human-induced activities like cattle ranching and soy plantations and logging and roads and dams, all of those things are basically causing a disruption in the water cycle. The climate of the Amazon is actually changing. Climate change is contributing to the drying of the forest, which is basically contributing to the disruption of the water cycle, and that's contributing to more climate change and to more weather disruptions. So it is a positive feedback loop that basically, unless we can address, the whole planet could be facing catastrophic repercussions from the loss of the Amazon and tropical rainforests in general. We've been hearing of the need to keep global weather temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees. In fact, a 2-degree rise in the weather, in our temperature, a 2-degree temperature rise would cause the dieback of 43% of plant species in the Amazon.
What would that mean?
Basically, already the rise in 0.8 degrees in temperatures has caused the dieback that we've seen. In 2005, the Amazon experienced a super drought. The same warming of the Atlantic that caused the hurricanes like Katrina brought us major droughts in the Amazon that were just unheard of. Entire tributaries dried up. Rivers became lakes. Millions of fish died. There were over 70,000 fires at one point in September of 2005. Many of them wildfires, including maybe started initially as forest fires that people set to clear pasture, but then became wildfires because the Amazon was so dry. And so what we are seeing is scientists are telling us that 3 years of a drought like that, Amazon had experienced 2 consecutive years of drought. A 3rd year would have created conditions that would have allowed for forest fires, mega fires that could actually consume 1/4 to 1/3 of the Amazon basin. So that is what we're facing. I think we're facing, you know, what also, you know, there's been a lot of discussion. A concept called the tipping point has been surfacing when we reference the water cycle. You know, the way scientists explain it to me, there's a great book called Extreme Weather, written by Peter Banyard, that includes a chapter on the hydrological cycle of the Amazon and climate change, the interplay between both how the Amazon contributes to carbon emissions and deforestation, and then how in turn climate change is contributing to the drying and the dying of the forests. So that phenomenon, he basically explained the water cycle, that really one drop of water from where it basically enters the water cycle from the Atlantic Ocean over the Amazon basin might circulate through transpiration of the trees and evaporation, might circulate as much as 6 or 7 times before it basically enters the global weather system. That is because the trees are physically breathing in and breathing out the moisture. Once you have deforestation, if an area of forest is more than 40% cleared, you physically disrupt the recycling of that water. And so that condition leads to basically a loss in the water cycle over the Amazon, which then has serious repercussions for global rainfall worldwide. So what would we mean for the Amazon? And the other thing is that the Amazon has so many layers of elevation, altitude, different conditions and climates, and most species live within specific ecoregions and only there and nowhere else. So if you have a 2-degree rise in temperature, that would make conditions impossible for those species to live in those ecosystems. And because they only live in those systems and nowhere else, we're talking about mass extinction of plant species. And that would, you know, of course, affect all the other species and all the other systems. So I think for us, you know, the Amazon, the tipping point conversation has to be had. Already the Amazon basin, you know, the Amazon basin is the size of the continental United States. It's massive. And yet, up to now, 15 to 20% has been completely cleared over the last 30 years. Another 20 to 22% has been severely degraded. Now, deforestation refers to an area that's completely denuded of trees. Degraded forests might still have trees, but it might have, you know, only 30 to 40% of its forest cover. And that generates a process of drying and creating conditions for the eventual dieback of the forest. So what you have is a situation where 15 to 20% is already denuded, another 20% or more is degraded. You're getting really perilously close on a basin-wide level to that tipping point. So that with every tree that is felled, with every road that's constructed, with every new dam, every new logging project, oil drilling project, etc., we're getting perilously close to that tipping point where the entire cycle could fall. Now, people are talking a lot about the need, and we have to reduce emissions. We have to reduce emissions from all sources. And so much of the conversation right now has been about reducing emissions due to our energy consumption. And I absolutely endorse that. And I do think that we have to reduce our consumption, especially in the north. And we cannot forget this huge X factor, and that is the Amazon basin and what happens with both deforestation, droughts, and, you know, the dieback that has already begun to occur. A tree is half carbon, and the vegetation, the soil contains carbon, the leaves and the branches contain carbon. When a tree is felled and it starts to decompose, or when it's burnt, or when a forest is cleared and the soil is exposed, all of those things are causing the release of carbon. So it's also imperative, as we talk about targets about energy efficient vehicles and new carbon-free energy systems, solar, wind, alternative energy, we must also talk about protecting the remaining tropical rainforests and continue to support efforts to, you know, we cannot even allow 2 degrees. We must deal with the fact that 2 degrees could be catastrophic on the Amazon, which in turn, even if we succeed under Kyoto and all of the goals that we set for ourselves for reduction of carbon in human-related activities, we could still have climate chaos and still face a complete annihilation of our life support systems if we don't have the tropical rainforest. So more than ever, this analogy of the heart of the earth, is becoming true. Not only is it the pumping the water through and the vapor and the heat through the world, without this forest, the planet will die back. The life support systems of the planet will be annihilated.
So what can be done? How can people relate to this?
Well, I think people can. There's a lot that can be done. For one, we need to stop subsidizing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry anywhere, but specifically in tropical rainforests. It makes absolutely no sense why the industry is spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year looking for new oil, gas, and coal reserves anywhere in the world when we can't even afford to burn half of the reserves we already have found. But on top of that, when you're combining, when you consider that a lot of that exploration is happening in tropical rainforest countries, it makes it doubly painful. I think we have to basically create no-go zones where industrial fossil fuel extraction cannot expand into areas like the Amazon. I also think we have to challenge this whole model of development where, right now there are plans in place to create what they call regional integration of South America. That includes a network of pipelines, roads, power lines, just like we have in this country, a network of infrastructure to integrate for development. But what is development? This kind of industrial development that is planned for the Amazon would destroy the life support system of the continent. The water cycle would be destroyed, and much of the continent's natural resources would basically also be squandered. So again, what is this model of development? It's an export-based model of development. These infrastructure projects that are being planned under a guise of an acronym IRSA is a package of 350 large-scale industrial projects that collectively put together would devastate the Amazon basin. Most of these projects are to bring basically to allow the export of natural resources from the heart of the planet to global markets. So these are basically export corridors and literally veins to take away the life support system of the planet, draining it for the global economy. So what people can do, specifically in the United States, we have institutions like the World Bank and the American Development Bank. Every year, our tax dollars are being used in these institutions to fund development. But most of the development that's being financed is basically the wrong kind of development. They're pipelines, roads, and things like oil development. And we have to basically stop the flow of subsidies and subsidized financing to these kinds of projects. Another thing we have to do is we have to put on the table in the next international treaties some kind of financial incentives for setting aside rainforests and protecting ecosystems. And this has to be something that is addressed. Developing countries need financial incentives in order to not drill and destroy in their forests. They could be given incentives to keep fossil fuels in the ground and to keep their forests protected. Now, there's a lot of problems with things like carbon credits. This is a concept that's been rejected by most of the indigenous peoples and a lot of the progressive organizations because it allows private control of the commons. However, even though carbon credits is not the right model, we need some form of financial incentive system that gives governments a way out where they don't have to destroy their forest to pay back their onerous debts. So one of the things we're calling for is debt relief for countries with tropical rainforest as an instrument of financial incentive to get these governments to change their policies and protect their forest. Another is supporting indigenous peoples. Land demarcation in the Amazon is a significant strategy. It works. The Amazon basin in all has about 20% of the Amazon is indigenous peoples' territories. And most scientists that have studied conservation areas and national parks are telling us some of the best conserved forest where there's little to no forest fires ever are indigenous peoples' territories. These are the true stakeholders. Their future survival, their culture, their way of life is all tied to a healthy forest. You don't have to pay them to be park guards like you do in a national park. You have to pay park guards to protect forests in national parks. In an indigenous peoples' territory, you just have to provide land title and support for communities to manage their territories and protect them. And so we support land titling, indigenous peoples' land rights, and local control of these resources to the control to the people who are most dependent on these resources and hence have the greatest stake in their future survival. In the Amazon basin, in addition to Brazil, you have Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, French Guyana, Suriname, and Bolivia. So as the Ecuadorian government started to produce oil, they became creditworthy. And so international financial institutions were able to convince these governments, often very corrupt politicians or short-lived politicians who had their own pet projects, they were able to be convinced to borrow money. Sometimes the money was for really frivolous things. One example of this odious debt is a giant yacht for $40 million with one of the, I think one of the European countries. So nobody knows where this yacht went. That's one example of the odious debt. There are other things, money that was basically used for projects that never had good payback and it never had good economic returns. And so the countries borrowed more than their ability to pay back, especially when the price of oil fluctuated. When the price of oil went down, the revenues went down. So they began to have a debt crisis and not able to pay back their debt. So through corruption and also an inability to pay back bad loans, they found themselves in these debt. Now, also it's important to say that until recently, the Ecuadorian government, the Ecuadorian currency was the sucre. Only recently, after it went bankrupt because of its onerous debt, it changed to the dollar. But because of the whole fact that loans were made in international exchange, in international currency like the dollar, the euro, etc., often that meant that there was the kinds of things that had to happen to pay back that debt had to be really resource intensive. So this is sort of the cycle of debt and oil development. One of the most exciting things that's happening right now is the new president, Rafael Correa of Ecuador, came into office in January. He did a number of things. One is he basically put a moratorium on the new oil and gas concessions in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in territories that were indigenous peoples' territories, because the indigenous communities that had lived there for the last decade have been fighting to keep out oil companies and have succeeded. They've kicked out a number of multinational oil companies, most recently ConocoPhillips. It's been a flashpoint of controversy. Indigenous peoples have demanded that their territories be off limits to the oil industry because they saw what the oil industry did in northern Ecuador when Texaco came in and drilled for oil and left billions of gallons of toxic waste and an area 3 times the size of Manhattan completely devastated and polluted. So indigenous peoples were calling for no more drilling in these areas. And so in addition, the president came in looking at the fact that for the last 35 years, as the Ecuadorian government, as the Ecuadorian economy became more reliant on oil revenues, the government became more indebted. As oil production grew, so did debt and corruption and poor governance and political instability. So having suffered these consequences of 35 years of oil development, when so much was promised that oil development would bring to Ecuador, the Ecuadorian government moved ahead and said, we want to try something else. So the largest oil reserve in Ecuador happens to be in the Yasuni National Park. And within the same area of the Yasuni National Park is where there are isolated bands of Tarominani and Tagueri indigenous populations who are very vulnerable to outside diseases and just very dependent on the forest. So this is an area that contains 20% of Ecuador's oil reserves, and it's been highly contested. So the president came in and said, we are willing to forgo drilling in the Yasuni National Park. We're giving the international community 1 year to come forth with a way that we can basically be compensated for half of the revenues that the government of Ecuador is going to forego by not drilling there. And this is a pretty incredibly innovative proposal. For one, it is basically the Ecuadorian government, by saying that it's willing to forego drilling for oil there, it is embracing sort of the beginning of a new path of a post-carbon, post-fossil fuel economy. So it is really the first government that has come forth with a proposal so progressive. How would you do this? How would you compensate the government for up to half of revenues from not drilling 1 billion barrels of oil? Well, one way that is being proposed is through debt relief. Up to now, Ecuador has basically had one of the highest per capita debts, external debts in the world. These debt payments were so onerous that a few years ago the IMF and the World Bank, in imposing their economic austerity measures on Ecuador, really called for Ecuadorian government to double oil production in the Amazon in order to pay back the debt. In fact, somewhere between 70 and 90% of oil revenues in the last 5 to 10 years have been going to pay just the interest on the debt. This isn't even oil for development. This has been really just oil development to pay back the debt. One of the ways that Ecuadorian government can receive financial incentives for foregoing oil development is to basically get debt relief. Debt relief would be one way where the government could reduce the need to go drill for more oil by not having to pay back the payments. So there are other ways: direct contributions for conservation of biodiversity, payment for things like protecting isolated and uncontacted peoples, the fact that the Yasuni National Park is a significant Pleistocene refuge. It survived the last ice age. It's where the species went during the last ice age, so it's one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. It has countless other values. This would be a decision to promote sustainable development, again, a new path out of the oil economy, etc., etc. So we're very excited about this proposal. There's a lot of debate going on about, well, how much is a barrel of oil worth to the Ecuadorian government? What are the assumptions and discount rates and oil prices that you assume over the next 25 years? And then what are the mechanisms to make sure that if there's a change in government, this policy will continue to mean the protection of the Yasuni rainforest? What is the money going to be spent on? How is the Ecuadorian government going to spend this money that it's going to receive? How are those revenues dedicated to things like renewable energy? In fact, the government wants to do that. Of the Yasuni oil reserves, it could be estimated that about half of the oil that would be extracted in Yasuni could be burned domestically in Ecuador. And if the Ecuadorian government is foregoing something like potentially up to 10% of its future oil supply, what does that mean for its energy matrix? And the government's committed, is saying that it wants to institute a plan to invest in renewable energy and alternative energy so that it takes the place of that 10% reduction in its oil consumption. We're very excited about the proposal and need to figure out the details. So Amazon Watch has been around about 10 years. We're working in many countries in the Amazon basin. Currently, we're taking on some of the largest oil companies in the United States. ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Texaco, Occidental Petroleum, and Hunt Oil are just some of the oil companies we're targeting. People can get involved in campaigns to pressure the oil industry to clean up their mess in the Amazon, to stay out of indigenous peoples' territories, and to pressure our governments and banks not to subsidize the oil industry's expansion, or the cattle industry or soy industry to expand into the Amazon rainforest. People can get in touch with us, become active, send letters, make contributions by going to AmazonWatch.org. And we have offices in Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco is our main headquarters, and we are also in Ecuador.